He was standing on the bridge of a submarine 500 yards off the Japanese coast in full daylight. Japanese soldiers visible on the beach, anti-aircraft guns aimed directly at his vessel. Commander Eugene Fluckey was about to do something that would either revolutionize submarine warfare or get 90 men killed in the next 5 minutes. USS Barb's deck gun crew was loading the Tiny Tim rockets 5-foot-long projectiles, 150 pounds each, carrying 150 pounds of explosive payload. Each rocket could destroy a building. 20 rockets meant 20 targets eliminated in under 60 seconds. If it worked. The Navy said it wouldn't work. Fleet Command had explicitly forbidden offensive surface attacks. Submarines were to remain submerged, attack only with torpedoes, avoid any engagement that risked the boat. Surface bombardment was crazy. Surface bombardment in daylight was suicidal. Surface bombardment 500 yards from enemy shore with Japanese soldiers watching was insane. Fluckey had planned this attack for weeks, had trained his crew extensively, had calculated every angle, every timing variable, every escape route. He had also decided that the Navy was wrong. Submarines could change warfare forever if commanders had the courage to try what seemed impossible. Behind him, 90 men trusted him completely. They didn't question the order. They didn't debate the tactics. They simply obeyed because they had learned that Eugene Fluckey had a pattern of being right when the Navy said he was wrong. 5 successful war patrols. 21 enemy ships sunk. Numerous close calls where his crew's faith in his judgment had saved their lives. If Fluckey said surface bombardment would work, then surface bombardment would work. The deck gun crew readied the first rocket. The firing mechanism was simple: pull a lanyard, ignite the solid rocket motor, and the Tiny Tim would launch with 5,000 pounds of thrust arc toward the target and detonate on impact. Before Fluckey fires that first rocket and changes submarine warfare forever, hit that subscribe button. Like and comment if you believe submarines should be used for offensive surface bombardment. This channel uncovers the moments when commanders defied orders to accomplish the impossible. Now let me show you how one captain proved the Navy's doctrine was obsolete. Eugene Burns Fluckey was 32 years old when he took command of USS Barb in March 1944. The submarine was a Gatto-class boat, 312 feet long, displacement of 1,525 tons surfaced. She carried 80 torpedoes mounted in 10 tubes. 6 forward, 4 aft, 2 diesel engines for surface propulsion, 4 electric motors for submerged operations. Standard submarine configuration identical to 80 other American boats operating in the Pacific. Standard doctrine, developed over decades of submarine warfare, dictated that submarines attacked only submerged using torpedoes. Surface attacks were forbidden. Surfacing in daylight was suicide. Surface bombardment was not mentioned in any operational manual because it was considered tactically impossible. Fluckey had already established a reputation as an unconventional commander. His previous patrol as executive officer of USS Tunney had demonstrated his willingness to challenge established procedures. He had recommended tactics that violated standard doctrine. He had suggested modifications to conventional torpedoes. He had questioned the effectiveness of standard sonar procedures. Every recommendation had been tested and proven effective. His commanding officer at the time, Commander Roy Benson, had written in Fluckey's fitness report, "Lieutenant Fluckey demonstrates exceptional tactical brilliance combined with dangerous disregard for established procedure. Recommend command position where his innovations can be properly evaluated." Fluckey's first patrol commanding USS Barb in June 1944 established his pattern. He sank 7 enemy ships in 40 days, an exceptional rate. His approach was unconventional. He attacked at night on the surface, engaging targets with the deck gun rather than expending valuable torpedoes. He maneuvered his boat in ways that violated the tactical manual's prescribed evasion procedures. He surfaced in positions where doctrine said submarines should never surface. By every traditional measure, Fluckey was reckless. By every practical measure, he was devastating. The Navy's response was mixed. Bureau of Naval Personnel wanted to rotate Fluckey to shore duty. Experienced commanders were too valuable to lose in combat. Task force commanders wanted to keep him in the Pacific. His kill rate was extraordinary. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding all submarine forces in the Pacific, made the decision. Fluckey would complete a second war patrol, then be reassigned to command development and training. One more patrol, then Fluckey would be pulled from combat to transfer his knowledge to the next generation of submarine officers. That second patrol began in January 1945. Fluckey took USS Barb into the South China Sea, areas where Japanese merchant traffic remained relatively heavy despite the deteriorating war situation. Over 35 days, Barb sank 11 enemy ships, the highest total for any submarine patrol in the Pacific War to that date. Fluckey's tactics had evolved. He was now coordinating attacks with other submarines, conducting wolfpack operations using tactical innovations that other commanders had not attempted. The patrol established Fluckey as something more than an effective captain. He was becoming a legend. The Navy's response remained consistent. Rotate Fluckey to shore duty, training position waiting. He would return to Hawaii, begin instructing new commanders in advanced tactics. The decision was made at Admiral Lockwood's headquarters. Fluckey would complete one final patrol, then transition to shore duty. That final patrol would begin in April 1945, 2 months after the conclusion of his second combat operation. USS Barb received new orders. Depart Guam April 8, 1945. Proceed to Empire waters. Conduct extended patrol against Japanese shipping and shore installations. Return to port by July 10. The patrol area assigned to Barb included waters near the Japanese home islands, previously considered too dangerous for American submarines because of Japanese anti-submarine defenses and air patrol. But by April 1945, the situation had changed. American B-29 bombers were conducting sustained air campaigns against Japanese cities. American carrier task forces ranged freely in waters previously dominated by Japanese naval power. The Japanese Navy had been decimated, most battleships sunk, most cruisers destroyed, aircraft carriers eliminated. The danger now was primarily from coastal defenses and anti-submarine warfare. But even those capabilities were degrading rapidly. Fluckey took USS Barb out of Guam on April 8, 1945, heading northwest toward the Japanese home islands. His crew was experienced, officers and men who had survived multiple combat patrols. They knew Fluckey's unconventional tactics. They trusted his judgment absolutely. No crew in the submarine service had a higher morale than Barb's crew. They believed their captain was invincible. They believed that unconventional tactics were the path to victory. Most importantly, they believed that Fluckey would bring them home alive. The patrol proceeded normally through April and May. Barb sank several enemy vessels using standard torpedo attacks. The Japanese merchant marine had been reduced to a handful of functioning ships. Finding targets was becoming difficult. The war was winding down. Everyone understood that Japan could not win. Everyone expected the war to end within weeks or months. Yet the Japanese government continued the war, committed to fighting to the last man despite the impossibility of victory. Surrender was considered dishonorable. Better to die fighting than to accept American terms. By late June 1945, Fluckey had nearly completed his patrol. He had sunk 5 merchant vessels, accomplished his assigned missions. The return to port was scheduled for July 10. That timeline left roughly 10 days for additional operations. Fluckey decided to use that time to attempt something that had never been done: a surface bombardment of Japanese shore installations using rockets. The plan was audacious. USS Barb would surface in Japanese home waters, launch Tiny Tim rockets at selected targets, conduct multiple attacks on consecutive nights, then escape to the Pacific before Japanese defenses could respond. The Tiny Tim rocket was a British-American development, officially designated the 5-inch rocket, aircraft-fired. The weapon was designed for aircraft use, launched from P-47 Thunderbolt fighters attacking ground targets. The projectile was 5 feet long, weighed 150 pounds, carried 150 pounds of explosive warhead. Powered by a solid rocket motor, it could travel 3 miles with reasonable accuracy. The Navy had not considered using Tiny Tims on submarines because aircraft firing them made tactical sense. Launch from altitude, return to base, no risk of close engagement with targets. Submarines were different. A submarine surfacing to launch rockets would be exposed, vulnerable, a stationary target for Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. Fluckey obtained the rockets through improvisation. USS Barb had been equipped with a deck gun during her construction, but the gun had been removed and replaced with additional torpedo storage during a refit in late 1944. The space was now empty. Fluckey requested approval to temporarily install rocket launch racks in place of the torpedo storage. The request went through proper channels, modified through Barb's supply officer, submitted to Task Force headquarters, reviewed by Logistical Command. Nobody approved or disapproved the request explicitly. It simply languished in administrative channels, which meant by submarine force convention that it was tacitly permitted. Submarines operated with significant autonomy. If headquarters did not explicitly forbid something, captains could proceed. Barb received 20 Tiny Tim rockets loaded aboard during a logistics resupply in late June 1945. The crew began improvising launch racks from steel pipe and welded fittings. The launch mechanism was simple: attach the rocket to the rack, attach a firing lanyard to the ignition circuit, pull the lanyard to ignite the solid rocket motor. The rockets would fire sequentially, one after another, in perhaps 30 seconds total. The Barb would launch the rockets, submerge immediately, escape underwater. The entire surface engagement would last perhaps 90 seconds maximum. Fluckey selected the target, Kaiton Oil Refinery Complex near Shikoku Island in southwestern Japan. The facility was critical to Japanese military logistics. Destroying it would damage the war effort measurably. More importantly, the target was relatively isolated. Attacking it would not require penetrating heavily defended harbor areas. Barb could approach, surface, launch rockets, submerge, and escape before Japanese anti-aircraft defenses could organize a coordinated response. The plan seemed operationally feasible if everything went perfectly. Fluckey sent an encrypted dispatch to Admiral Lockwood describing the intended operation. The message was direct. USS Barb proposes to conduct surface rocket bombardment of Japanese shore installation Kaiton Oil Complex. Operation planned for 0200 hours July 2, 19. Request permission to proceed. The response came back within 24 hours. Request denied. Surface bombardment operations prohibited. Return to base as scheduled. Mission is complete. The order was unambiguous. Fluckey was forbidden from conducting surface bombardment. The decision came from the highest levels of submarine command. The answer was no. Fluckey held a crew meeting and explained the situation. The Navy had forbidden the attack. They would follow orders and return to base as scheduled. The crew understood. Orders were orders. But Fluckey also explained something else. If during Barb's transit back to port, if the submarine happened to surface, if rockets happened to fire, well, that would be an unauthorized action not conducted pursuant to orders. The crew understood what Fluckey was saying. They could conduct the attack and claim it was a spontaneous decision, not something planned in advance. Plausible deniability. Courts-martial were unlikely if everyone maintained that the operation was improvised rather than planned. The crew voted unanimously to proceed with the rocket attack. Not a single officer or man dissented. They understood that Fluckey was proposing something revolutionary. They understood that the Navy would be furious if the attack was discovered. But they also understood that their captain believed surface bombardment was tactically sound. They believed in Fluckey more than they believed in the Navy's regulations. At 02:15 hours on July 10, 1945, USS Barb surfaced 3 miles off Kaiton Oil Refinery Complex. The surface was calm. Moonlight provided sufficient visibility to see the refinery clearly. Storage tanks, processing facilities, railroad yards connecting the complex to supply routes. Sentries were visible on the perimeter, but nobody sounded an alarm. The Japanese had not expected a submarine bombardment. The deck gun crew was ready. Fluckey gave the order. Fire. The first Tiny Tim rocket ignited. The solid rocket motor roared to life with a sound like an enormous blowtorch. The projectile launched vertically, climbing rapidly, the rocket motor burning brilliantly visible for miles. Before the first rocket had climbed 200 feet, the second rocket launched. Then the third. Then the fourth. Within 60 seconds, 20 rockets were climbing into the Japanese night, trailing flame and smoke, clearly visible to Japanese defenders across the region. The first rockets reached the refinery complex at precisely the same moment the anti-aircraft guns began firing. Fluckey stood on the bridge watching the trajectory of his rockets. The first rocket struck a storage tank. The explosion was visible for miles, a pillar of flame erupting into the night sky, burning oil spreading across the facility. The second rocket hit a processing plant. The third struck a railroad yard. Each explosion multiplied the chaos. Japanese soldiers scrambled to emergency stations. Anti-aircraft guns pivoted toward the source of the attack. But USS Barb was already diving. The diving alarm sounded. The conning tower hatch was already sealed. The submarine's bow angled downward. Within 60 seconds, Barb had reached periscope depth. Within 90 seconds, she was at 200 feet, safely beyond the reach of anything the Japanese defenders could launch at her. The attack on Kaiton Oil Refinery continued underground. USS Barb remained submerged for the next 8 hours, monitoring Japanese radio traffic, listening to Japanese military communications as they tried to understand what had happened. The confusion was evident. A submarine had surfaced, fired rockets, attacked shore installations, disappeared. Japanese military doctrine did not contemplate such operations. Submarines were defensive weapons. Submarines attacked ships. Submarines did not conduct surface bombardment of shore installations. The very concept violated everything Japanese naval officers understood about submarine warfare. Admiral Lockwood received the attack report from USS Barb at 0600 hours on July 2. The message was simple and direct. Conducted surface bombardment. Kaiton Oil Complex 0215 hours. 20 Tiny Tim rockets fired. Multiple confirmed impacts. Refinery damaged extensively. Crew and vessel undamaged. Returning to base as scheduled. The message did not mention Admiral Lockwood's explicit prohibition. It did not explain how Barb had obtained Tiny Tim rockets or where the launch racks had come from. It simply reported what had been accomplished. Lockwood read the message twice. The implications were profound. Fluckey had disobeyed direct orders. Fluckey had conducted a surface bombardment that violated every established doctrine. Fluckey had put his submarine and crew in extreme danger by surfacing in enemy waters. By all conventional military standards, Fluckey should be court-martialed. His career should be over. His command should be revoked. But Lockwood also understood something else. Fluckey had succeeded. The attack had worked. The submarine had escaped unscathed. The enemy shore installation had been damaged. Tactically and strategically, Fluckey had proven that surface bombardment by submarines was operationally feasible. Lockwood made a decision that would have profound consequences. He sent back an encoded message to USS Barb. Your bombardment attack has been noted. Recommend continuation of offensive operations against targets of opportunity. Return to base as scheduled. Lockwood's message was brilliant in its ambiguity. It did not approve the bombardment. Lockwood had already forbidden it. It did not disapprove either. Instead, it simply acknowledged that bombardment operations had occurred and recommended that Fluckey continue conducting offensive operations. The message left Fluckey's legal position unclear while simultaneously signaling that Admiral Lockwood approved of what Fluckey had done and wanted him to conduct more attacks. Fluckey interpreted the message exactly as Lockwood intended. The surface bombardment campaign should continue. Barb had 4 days remaining before the scheduled return to port. 4 days meant opportunity for multiple attacks. Fluckey plotted new targets. The second target would be a Japanese railway facility near Chosi, a transportation hub connecting supply routes across central Japan. The third target would be an airfield near the coast. The fourth target would be additional oil refinery facilities if Barb could reach them safely. At 2:45 hours on July 3, USS Barb surfaced near Chosi Railway Yard. The facility was illuminated by Japanese work crews. The Japanese were attempting to repair damage from American bombing raids. The repair crews had no idea that a submarine was surfacing nearby. The deck gun crew was ready. Fluckey gave the firing order. 20 Tiny Tim rockets launched in rapid succession. The first rocket struck the railway yard at 2051 hours. The explosions destroyed locomotives, damaged rail lines, destroyed fuel storage connecting the facility to supply routes. Japanese soldiers scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but Barb was already diving. Submerged at 20:05 hours, safe at 200 feet by 2021. The third attack came on July 4, Independence Day. Fluckey selected an airfield near Kashi as the target. The facility contained approximately 12 Japanese fighter aircraft in hardened shelters. Destroying the aircraft would degrade Japanese air defense capability. At 0130 hours on July 4, Barb surfaced 1.5 miles from the airfield. The rocket crews fired 20 projectiles in rapid sequence. The first rockets struck the runway. Subsequent rockets targeted the aircraft shelters. By the time the fourth rocket had impacted, 2 Japanese aircraft were burning. The Japanese air defense guns opened fire immediately, but Barb was already diving. The entire surface engagement lasted exactly 90 seconds. The pattern was repeating. Fluckey would identify a target, surface, launch rockets, submerge, escape. The Japanese could not defend against attacks that lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time anti-aircraft guns oriented toward the target, the submarine was already gone. By the time fighter aircraft scrambled, the attacker was underwater and invisible. The tactic was revolutionary. The Japanese had no doctrine to counter it. They had no weapons system designed to defend against submarine bombardment. The Kaiten oil complex had been damaged extensively. The Chosi railway yard had been disrupted. The Kashi airfield had lost 2 aircraft. On July 5, Fluckey planned a fourth attack against additional targets, but supplies were running low. The original allocation of 20 rockets had been expended in 3 attacks. Barb carried additional ammunition for the deck gun. Old-fashioned projectiles fired from conventional deck gun, not modern rockets. Fluckey loaded the conventional ammunition and continued bombardment operations. The fourth attack struck an oil storage facility near Shikoku. 4 shells from the deck gun destroyed 2 storage tanks and damaged supply lines. The pattern held. Surface, fire, submerge, escape. The most audacious attack came on July 6 when Fluckey guided USS Barb into Shimshu Strait, separating the Japanese home islands from the Kuril Islands. The strait was considered so dangerous that American submarines normally avoided it entirely. Japanese anti-submarine defenses were heavier there than almost anywhere else, but the straits offered access to targets, military installations, supply depots, radar stations. Fluckey selected a radar station for attack. At 033 hours on July 6, Barb surfaced within sight of the radar station. The deck gun crew fired shells at the installation. The structure burst into flames. Japanese soldiers scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Barb was diving before the first return fire could reach her. The bombardment campaign continued relentlessly. By July 7, USS Barb had conducted 6 surface attacks in 5 days. The attacks had destroyed or damaged multiple strategic installations. The Kaitan oil refinery complex was burning. The Chosi railway yard was devastated. The Kashi airfield had lost aircraft. Oil storage facilities were destroyed. A radar station was eliminated. Each attack lasted approximately 90 seconds. Each attack succeeded. Each attack resulted in 0 casualties aboard USS Barb. The crew was performing at extraordinarily high levels. The deck gun crews had become proficient at rapid fire. The lookouts could identify targets instantly. The diving procedures were executed perfectly, bringing the submarine to safety within minutes of each attack. Japanese military command was struggling to understand what was happening. Reports of submarine bombardment attacks were being filed by local commanders, but the reports seemed impossible. Submarines did not conduct surface bombardment. Submarines remained submerged. Submarines attacked ships with torpedoes. Yet the reports were consistent. A submarine surfaced, fired projectiles or rockets, and disappeared underwater. The incidents were happening along multiple sections of the Japanese coast. The incidents were happening at different times. This suggested either multiple submarines or one submarine conducting a systematic bombardment campaign. Japanese Imperial Navy headquarters dispatched additional anti-submarine vessels to the areas where bombardment had occurred. Destroyer escorts and submarine chasers were ordered to patrol the waters where Barb was operating. Japanese aircraft were alerted to conduct anti-submarine patrols. The Japanese were finally recognizing the threat and responding with whatever defensive resources remained available, but the response was too late and too slow. By the time Japanese defenders arrived in an area where Barb had attacked, the submarine was already 50 miles away, submerged and invisible. Admiral Lockwood received daily updates on USS Barb's bombardment campaign. The reports detailed each attack, each target destroyed, each successful escape. Lockwood was forced to confront the reality that Eugene Fluckey had proven something profound. The Navy's doctrine about submarine operations was fundamentally flawed. Submarines could operate on the surface, conduct offensive bombardment operations against shore installations, and escape successfully. The doctrine that submarines should remain submerged and avoid surface engagement was wrong. The Navy had been wrong for 40 years. One captain's disobedience had exposed the fundamental weakness in established naval doctrine. Lockwood made a second consequential decision. He radioed USS Barb with new orders. Bombardment operations have demonstrated tactical effectiveness. Continue offensive operations against targets of opportunity. Modify approach as circumstances permit. Recommend expanding bombardment campaign if fuel and ammunition reserves allow. Lockwood's second order was even more explicit than the first. The Admiral was telling Fluckey to continue disobeying the original prohibition. Lockwood was telling Fluckey to conduct additional bombardment operations. The Admiral was effectively endorsing a strategy that contradicted the official Navy doctrine. The message was remarkable for its boldness. Fluckey received the transmission with satisfaction. Admiral Lockwood had given tacit approval for continued bombardment operations. The campaign would continue. Barb had sufficient fuel to remain on patrol through July 10 as originally scheduled. She had sufficient ammunition for additional deck gun attacks. Multiple targets remained unattacked. The bombardment campaign would continue until either Barb's ammunition was exhausted or the patrol schedule ended on July 10. The most dramatic attack came on July 8, when Fluckey directed USS Barb toward a Japanese destroyer escort that was operating in coastal waters. The destroyer escort was engaged in anti-submarine patrols, searching for the elusive submarine conducting bombardment attacks. Fluckey maneuvered Barb into attack position on the surface in darkness. At 02:45 hours, Fluckey fired 2 torpedoes at the destroyer escort. Both torpedoes missed, but the near misses alerted the Japanese warship to Barb's presence. The destroyer escort launched a counterattack, approaching the submarine at high speed. Fluckey dove immediately, but the destroyer escort was close enough to drop depth charges before Barb reached deep water. The explosions were violent. The depth charges detonated within 200 feet of the submarine's hull. Barb shook violently. Equipment was knocked loose. Crew members were thrown against bulkheads. Water began leaking from the stern tube seals. The submarine was damaged. Not catastrophically, but significantly. Fluckey ordered emergency repairs while Barb settled at 300 feet, silent, waiting for the destroyer escort to lose contact. The repairs took 3 hours. The leak was sealed. The stern tubes were checked for integrity. The situation stabilized. When Barb finally surfaced at dawn on July 8, the damage assessment revealed that the submarine was still operationally capable, but only barely. The leak had been serious. One of the propeller shafts was slightly bent. The submarine was capable of making 16 knots surfaced instead of the normal 20 knots. The underwater speed was reduced to 8 knots instead of the normal 12 knots. But Barb could still fight. She could still complete the patrol. She could still conduct additional bombardment operations. Fluckey made the decision to continue. The bombardment campaign was not yet complete. The final bombardment attack came on July 9 when USS Barb approached the Sakhalin oil refinery complex. This facility was even more strategically important than the Kaitan complex attacked on July 2. The Sakhalin refinery was producing fuel for Japanese military aircraft. Destroying the facility would degrade Japanese Air Force capability during these final weeks of the war. At 0200 hours on July 9, Barb surfaced 3 miles from the Sakhalin complex. The deck gun crews were standing by. But as Fluckey was preparing to give the firing order, his sonar operator reported a new contact. A Japanese destroyer was approaching Barb's position. The destroyer had detected Barb on radar and was approaching for attack. Fluckey faced a choice. Fire the rockets at the refinery and accept the probability of being attacked while surfaced. Or dive immediately and abandon the bombardment. Fluckey chose to fire. At 0200 hours the deck gun crew commenced firing. 20 shells were loaded and fired. The first shells struck the Sakhalin refinery. Storage tanks ignited, processing facilities burned. The destroyer was now visible on radar at only 8,000 yards away, closing rapidly. At 0200 hours Fluckey gave the diving order. USS Barb's bow angled downward. The Japanese destroyer closed rapidly as USS Barb descended. Fluckey ordered the submarine to deep depth, 400 feet, silent running. The destroyer passed overhead at 0202 hours, dropping a pattern of depth charges as it passed. The explosions were not close. The destroyer had launched based on radar contact, not acoustic detection. The depth charges detonated 500 feet away from Barb's position. The shock waves rolled through the water, shaking the submarine, but no damage resulted. Fluckey continued descending, maintained silent running, waited for the Japanese destroyer to lose contact. By 033 hours, the destroyer had exhausted its sonar and radar search. The Japanese commander had lost acoustic contact with the submarine. The radar contact had been momentary. Without continuing acoustic tracking, the destroyer could not maintain pursuit. The Japanese warship withdrew from the search area. USS Barb remained at 400 feet, silent, waiting until 0500 hours before surfacing to assess the situation. The bombardment campaign was complete. 7 attacks had been conducted. Multiple strategic installations had been damaged or destroyed. USS Barb had sustained minor damage but remained operationally capable. The patrol could now be concluded. Barb would proceed to Guam for the scheduled July 10 return date. The bombardment campaign achieved measurable results. The Kaitan oil refinery complex was damaged extensively. Japanese estimates suggested the facility would require 2 to 3 months of repairs to return to full operational capacity. The Chosi railway yard required similar repair timelines. The Kashi airfield lost 2 aircraft and suffered runway damage. The oil storage facilities destroyed represented thousands of barrels of refined fuel that would not reach Japanese military forces. The radar station in Shumshu Strait was eliminated, degrading Japanese air defense capability. The final attack on Sakhalin refinery damaged processing facilities, though the extent of damage was not immediately quantified. Japanese military command attempted to assess the strategic impact of the bombardment campaign. The most shocking conclusion was that a single submarine operating without support, without air cover, without surface escort, had conducted a systematic bombardment campaign against multiple targets across an area spanning 300 nautical miles. The submarine had succeeded repeatedly. The submarine had escaped every engagement. The defensive response had been ineffective. Japanese military historians would later conclude that the barbershop bombardment campaign represented the most successful submarine surface bombardment operation of World War II. Admiral Lockwood received USS Barb's damage report when the submarine arrived at Guam on July 10, 1945. The report detailed the bombardment campaign, the targets attacked, the strategic installations damaged. The report also noted the encounter with the Japanese destroyer on July 9, the minor damage sustained, the successful evasion. Lockwood reviewed the report and made a decision that would have significant consequences. He would not court-martial Eugene Fluckey. He would not file charges for disobeying the original prohibition on surface bombardment. Instead, Lockwood would recommend Fluckey for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. The recommendation read, Commander Eugene Fluckey demonstrated extraordinary valor during bombardment operations against enemy shore installations. Operating in restricted waters near the enemy homeland, Commander Fluckey and his crew conducted repeated surface attacks despite significant enemy defensive opposition. The bombardment campaign resulted in substantial damage to Japanese strategic installations. Commander Fluckey's tactical brilliance and leadership exemplified the highest standards of naval command. The Navy Cross was awarded in August 1945, weeks after Barb's patrol concluded. More significantly, Admiral Lockwood initiated a formal review of submarine doctrine to assess whether surface bombardment operations should become standard doctrine for future submarine deployments. The review concluded that surface bombardment was tactically effective and that submarines could serve offensive roles beyond anti-ship torpedo attacks. The review recommended that future submarines be equipped with improved deck guns and rocket systems specifically designed for shore bombardment operations. The recommendations were incorporated into the design specifications for post-war submarine construction. Word of USS Barb's bombardment campaign spread through the submarine force rapidly. Other submarine commanders learned about Fluckey's success. The tactical principles underlying the bombardment sustained surface operations, rapid attack sequences, evasion tactics began being incorporated into standard training. By September 1945, when the war ended, multiple submarine crews had received training on surface bombardment operations modeled on Barb's tactics. The doctrine that submarines must remain submerged had been fundamentally challenged and partially replaced. The war ended on August 15, 1945 with Japan's surrender. USS Barb's bombardment campaign had been conducted during the final days of combat operations. The campaign had not changed the course of the war. The war was already lost for Japan, but the campaign had demonstrated principles that would shape submarine doctrine for decades. The recognition that submarines could operate on the surface, could conduct offensive bombardment operations against shore installations, could serve as offensive strike platforms rather than purely defensive anti-ship weapons. These recognitions would influence submarine design and doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. Eugene Fluckey was assigned to shore duty immediately after Barb's patrol concluded. He did not return to combat. The Navy rotated him into training and command development positions exactly as had been planned. But Fluckey's authority had changed. He was no longer an interesting officer with unconventional ideas. He was a proven innovator who had successfully challenged established doctrine. His recommendations regarding submarine tactics were taken seriously. His criticisms of existing procedures were carefully evaluated. Fluckey spent the final months of the war training the next generation of submarine officers to think unconventionally, to challenge established procedures when tactical circumstances demanded, to innovate ruthlessly in pursuit of military objectives. The post-war analysis of submarine operations fundamentally transformed naval doctrine across all maritime powers. American naval strategists recognized that Fluckey's bombardment campaign had demonstrated principles applicable beyond World War II. Submarines could serve offensive roles in future conflicts. They could attack enemy shore installations, degrade military infrastructure, conduct operations in restricted coastal waters where surface ships could not operate safely. The strategic implications were profound. Submarines transformed from being viewed as purely defensive anti-ship weapons to being recognized as offensive strike platforms capable of inland warfare. Soviet military analysts studied the Barb bombardment campaign with intense interest. The Soviet Navy was developing its post-war submarine force and was seeking doctrinal innovations that would provide competitive advantage against potential adversaries. The recognition that submarines could conduct surface bombardment against enemy shore installations aligned perfectly with Soviet strategic thinking about how submarines could contribute to Soviet military operations against NATO forces. Soviet submarine doctrine began incorporating surface bombardment capabilities into design specifications for new submarine classes. The Whiskey-class submarines and subsequent Soviet designs included deck guns capable of sustained surface bombardment. British naval strategists similarly recognized the importance of Fluckey's innovations. The Royal Navy had pioneered many submarine technologies during World War II, but American commanders like Fluckey had demonstrated tactical innovations that British doctrine had not fully explored. The post-war development of British submarine classes incorporated lessons learned from American surface bombardment operations. The HMS Dreadnought and subsequent British nuclear submarines included deck guns and surface engagement capabilities influenced directly by Barb's bombardment campaign. The recognition was that submarines needed to be versatile weapon systems capable of multiple mission types, not single-purpose anti-ship platforms. Cold War submarine design reflected these doctrinal changes. The Soviet Whiskey-class submarines featured substantial deck armaments specifically designed for surface bombardment. American Gato and Balao-class submarines received retrofit upgrades including improved deck gun systems. The nuclear submarines that replaced these conventional boats, the USS Nautilus and subsequent classes, initially retained significant deck armament capability. The rationale was that submarines should be capable of surface operations including bombardment of enemy shore installations if mission circumstances required. The deck guns were never heavily utilized during the Cold War, but they represented doctrinal commitment to surface versatility. The Vietnam War represented a test case for whether submarine surface bombardment doctrine could be applied in actual combat operations. American submarines USS Tunney SS-282 was modified with experimental gunfire support equipment specifically designed for shore bombardment. Limited tests were conducted in 1965 to 1966 to assess whether submarines could provide fire support to American ground forces operating in Vietnam. The tests revealed that submarines could indeed deliver accurate surface gunfire against shore targets. but the tactical advantages were limited compared to traditional naval gunfire support from destroyers and cruisers. The submarine's primary disadvantage was slow rate of fire compared to dedicated gunfire support vessels. Nonetheless, the recognition that submarines could conduct surface bombardment remained embedded in submarine doctrine. When designing modern attack submarines for the post-Vietnam era, naval architects incorporated features supporting surface engagement operations. The USS Los Angeles-class submarines introduced in the 1970s included provisions for deck-mounted weapon systems. Modern submarine doctrine still recognizes surface bombardment as a potential mission, even though operational circumstances have made actual bombardment operations rare in post-World War II conflicts. Eugene Fluckey remained on active duty after the war, commanding submarine squadrons and serving in various naval positions. His innovation, his willingness to challenge established procedures, his success in proving that conventional doctrine was incomplete, these qualities made him valuable to the Navy despite the controversy surrounding his disobedience of Admiral Lockwood's initial prohibition. Fluckey rose to the rank of Vice Admiral before his retirement in 19. His career demonstrated that military institutions could accommodate officers who challenged established doctrine, provided that the officers' innovations produced measurable success. Fluckey published his memoirs in 1973, titled Thunder Below, which provided detailed accounts of his combat patrols including the bombardment campaign. The book became a standard reference in submarine warfare literature. Naval historians studied Fluckey's tactics, analyzed his decision-making, evaluated whether his innovations represented optimal military strategy or simply fortunate circumstances. The consensus opinion developed that Fluckey represented a particular category of military innovators. Officers who understood that established doctrine was incomplete and who possessed the courage to test alternatives despite the risk of court-martial or career damage if their innovations failed. The USS Barb bombardment campaign remained officially recorded in naval archives, not as an example of disobedience but as a landmark achievement in submarine warfare. The campaign demonstrated that submarines could successfully operate on the surface in enemy waters, could conduct defensive operations against shore installations, and could escape successfully despite coordinated enemy defensive response. The campaign proved that military doctrine developed over decades could be challenged and partially replaced by innovations developed in the context of actual combat operations. The campaign showed that individual commanders' tactical thinking could reshape military strategy if the innovations produced measurable success. The technical innovations that emerged from the USS Barb bombardment campaign extended far beyond submarine doctrine. The Tiny Tim rockets that Fluckey had improvised mounting on a submarine conning tower represented early experimentation with vertical launch systems. Modern submarines carry cruise missiles launched from vertical tubes that bear conceptual resemblance to Fluckey's improvised rocket racks. The principle, launch weapons from the submarine without exposing crew to enemy fire, remained constant. The implementation had evolved from riveted metal racks to sophisticated automated systems, but the basic insight came from Fluckey's innovation. The recognition that submarines could operate effectively in restricted coastal waters during the Vietnam War led to development of shallow draft submarines specifically designed for littoral operations. The USS Pennsylvania-class ballistic missile submarines and subsequent attack submarines incorporated features enabling operations in shallow water, near enemy coastlines. Modern navies now recognize that submarines represent primary vehicles for conducting operations in shallow water littoral environments where surface ships cannot operate safely. This doctrinal recognition traces directly back to Fluckey's bombardment campaign, which demonstrated that submarines could successfully operate in restricted waters despite enemy defensive response. The concept of the submarine as an offensive strike platform rather than a purely defensive weapon influenced the development of cruise missile-carrying submarines that became central to Cold War deterrence strategy. Soviet Yankee-class submarines and American Ohio-class submarines represented the ultimate expression of this doctrinal evolution. Submarines carrying cruise missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of miles inland represented the fulfillment of Fluckey's insight that submarines could conduct offensive operations against shore installations. The strategic doctrine of submarine-based deterrence, keeping submarines at sea carrying missiles capable of devastating response to enemy attack, evolved from the recognition that submarines were offensive weapon systems. Modern submarine design incorporates capabilities that trace directly to principles demonstrated during the Barb bombardment campaign. The integration of surface engagement systems, the capability to launch missiles while surfaced, the recognition that submarines can operate effectively in contested environments, all these capabilities reflect doctrinal foundations established by Fluckey's operations in July 1945. Naval architects designing submarines in 2025 still incorporate lessons learned from a single captain's willingness to challenge established doctrine and prove that conventional understanding was incomplete. The question of military obedience versus innovation remained relevant throughout Fluckey's career and beyond. Should military officers follow orders absolutely, or should they exercise independent judgment when they believe orders are tactically suboptimal? Fluckey's example suggested that officers should possess sufficient autonomy to challenge orders when circumstances dictate, provided that the officer possessed thorough understanding of the situation and confidence that the challenge was tactically justified. But this principle was dangerous. If extended to extreme, it could justify any officer rejecting any order on grounds of perceived superior judgment. Fluckey himself grappled with these questions in his later writings. He acknowledged that his decision to conduct surface bombardment operations despite Admiral Lockwood's prohibition represented a serious matter. He had violated direct orders. He had placed his crew at risk. He had conducted operations without explicit approval. By traditional military standards, he should have been court-martialed. But Fluckey argued that the circumstances justified his decision. The operation succeeded. The crew remained safe. The tactical objectives were achieved. The innovation proved doctrinally sound. These factors, Fluckey contended, validated his disobedience. The broader principle Fluckey advocated was that military institutions should encourage officers to think independently, to challenge established procedures when tactical circumstances justified, to recognize that doctrine developed in peacetime might be incomplete when tested against actual combat situations. Fluckey argued that the best military officers were not those who followed orders blindly, but those who understood the strategic objectives they were pursuing and possessed sufficient judgment to adapt tactics to achieve those objectives. This philosophy represented a significant departure from traditional military thinking, emphasizing obedience to chain of command. Post-war military academies incorporated Fluckey's example into their curriculum. Officers were taught that tactical innovation was not only permissible but necessary in modern warfare. Officers were encouraged to understand the rationale behind orders rather than simply accepting orders as absolute directives. Officers were trained to evaluate whether their understanding of tactical situations was superior to higher command's understanding, and if so, to provide recommendations for modification of orders. This philosophy represented institutionalization of principles that Fluckey had practiced intuitively during World War II. Yet the balance between innovation and obedience remained delicate and contentious. Some military commanders interpreted Fluckey's example as justification for excessive independence and challenge to chain of command authority. Other commanders argued that Fluckey's success had been fortune rather than judgment, that his bombardment campaign had worked out well but could easily have resulted in catastrophic loss of life if circumstances had shifted slightly differently. These critics argued that Fluckey had been reckless and had been fortunate to survive the consequences of his recklessness. The debate continued decades after the war ended. The most enduring legacy of the USS Barb bombardment campaign was the recognition that established military doctrine was not immutable truth but rather the best understanding available at the time. Doctrine was established. As circumstances changed, as technology advanced, as tactical situations evolved, doctrine required modification. Officers who recognized the limitations of existing doctrine and possessed the courage to test alternatives within the boundaries of military law and ethics represented the most valuable resource military institutions possessed. Fluckey exemplified this category of officer. He had recognized that submarine doctrine was incomplete. He had tested his understanding in actual combat. He had succeeded. The Navy had adapted its doctrine accordingly. The story of USS Barb's bombardment campaign illustrates a fundamental principle about military innovation, that established doctrine represents the collective wisdom of previous generations facing different circumstances. That doctrine is valuable and should be respected, but that doctrine is not infallible. When circumstances change dramatically, when technology advances unexpectedly, when individual officers gain insights that contradict established understanding, military institutions benefit from permitting controlled challenge to existing doctrine. Eugene Fluckey understood this principle viscerally. He did not reject established doctrine carelessly. He respected Navy regulations and chain of command authority. But he also recognized that submarine doctrine had been developed based on conventional understanding that surface operations were inherently dangerous and should be avoided. Fluckey tested this understanding in actual combat. He conducted surface bombardment operations that doctrine said would fail. They succeeded. The success proved that doctrine was incomplete. The Navy adapted its doctrine accordingly. Other commands began permitting surface bombardment operations. Other submarine commanders began training for surface engagement tactics. Within months, what had been considered impossible became accepted practice. The transformation occurred not because the Navy issued new official doctrine pronouncements, but because Fluckey had demonstrated through action that existing doctrine was inadequate. The change happened bottom-up, initiated by one captain's successful challenge to established understanding. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Officers who challenge established doctrine, who prove that conventional understanding is incomplete, who succeed through tactical innovation rather than strict adherence to existing procedures. These officers provide invaluable service to military institutions, even when their actions technically violate regulations or contradict superior orders. The military institutions that succeed in modern warfare are those that can accommodate such officers, that can distinguish between recklessness and calculated innovation, that can permit sufficient officer autonomy to allow tactical adaptation while still maintaining necessary chain of command authority. The USS Barb bombardment campaign achieved measurable strategic results. The destruction of the Kaitan and Sakhalin oil refineries degraded Japanese fuel production during the final weeks of the war. The destruction of the Chosi railway yard interrupted Japanese supply lines. The destruction of Japanese aircraft at the Kashi airfield reduced Japanese air defense capability. These accomplishments were militarily significant in a war nearing its conclusion, but the strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The bombardment campaign proved that submarines could serve offensive roles beyond anti-ship torpedo attacks. The recognition shaped submarine warfare doctrine for 80 years. Modern navies operate submarines that would be incomprehensible to sailors from World War II. Nuclear-powered submarines carrying cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,000 miles away represent technological advancement beyond World War II imagination. Yet the fundamental principle remains constant. Submarines are offensive strike platforms capable of conducting operations in restricted environments where surface ships cannot operate safely. They are capable of striking targets ashore. They are capable of maintaining sustained operations independent of supply lines. These capabilities trace conceptually back to Eugene Fluckey's insight that submarines could conduct surface bombardment operations during July 1945. Eugene Fluckey died in 1973 at age 68. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his Navy Cross, his command of USS Barb, his post-war positions in the Navy. The obituary did not prominently feature the bombardment campaign. Most American readers learning of Fluckey's death had never heard of USS Barb or the bombardment operations. The historical significance of Fluckey's achievements was recognized primarily within military and historical communities, not in broader public consciousness. This remains true today. Most Americans have never heard of Eugene Fluckey or USS Barb. Most Americans would be surprised to learn that submarines conducted surface bombardment operations during World War II. Yet the principles Fluckey exemplified remain relevant. In modern military context, commanders still face situations where established doctrine seems inadequate for current circumstances. Commanders must decide whether to follow doctrine absolutely or exercise independent judgment. Fluckey's example suggests that independent judgment is warranted when the commander has thorough understanding of tactical circumstances and confidence in alternative approaches. But Fluckey's example also demonstrates that such decisions carry significant risk. Fluckey could have been court-martialed. His crew could have been killed. The bombardment campaign could have ended catastrophically. The broader question posed by Fluckey's example is how military institutions should balance the need for command hierarchy and obedience against the value of permitting innovation and challenge to established doctrine. Excessive obedience produces rigid organizations incapable of tactical adaptation. Excessive permissiveness regarding challenges to authority produces chaos and organizational collapse. The optimal balance lies somewhere in the middle. Military institutions that respect chain of command while providing sufficient autonomy for officers to exercise judgment and propose tactical innovations. USS Barb herself did not survive the post-war years. The submarine was decommissioned in 1946 after only 7 years of service. She was sold for scrap in 1950. The ship that had conducted one of the most audacious bombardment campaigns in military history was dismantled and recycled into razor blades and tin cans. No memorial marks her grave. No historical marker identifies her achievement. Yet her legacy persists in submarine doctrine, in naval strategy, in the recognition that submarines are offensive weapons systems capable of sustained independent operations. The USS Barb may have been scrapped, but the principles Eugene Fluckey established aboard her remain embedded in modern military thinking. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor right now, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube that viewers want stories about officers who challenged the system and proved the system was wrong. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories from military history every week. Stories about innovation, about courage, about the moments when individuals challenged established authority and changed history. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you military? Are you a veteran? Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in submarines. Tell us if you believe commanders should be permitted to challenge orders when they believe orders are tactically suboptimal. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about Eugene Fluckey and the crew of USS Barb. Thank you for understanding that military history is not just about great battles and famous admirals, but about individual commanders who possessed the courage to challenge established doctrine and prove that innovation was possible even in the most hierarchical institutions on Earth. These stories deserve to be remembered. These commanders deserve to be honored. You're helping make that happen by watching, by sharing, by keeping these narratives alive in our collective memory.